And I was going to say, if you want some different structure to the answers than what I give you, say so.
Okay.
And we can adjust things as need be.
Which commanding officers participated in the maneuvers, and what role did they subsequently play in World War II?
Well, in the Louisiana maneuvers, the best known commanders are three. The first being George C. Marshall, who at the time was the Army Chief of Staff. And while Marshall doesn't directly participate in the maneuvers, he's really the driving force behind them happening and the driving force behind the organization. He, of course, remains as Chief of Staff of the Army throughout World War II, and then, of course, goes on to then be Secretary of State. Dwight Eisenhower is participating. At the time, though, he's only a lieutenant colonel. And he serves during the maneuvers as the Chief of Staff to Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, who commanded one of the two armies that were involved in the maneuvers. And for Eisenhower, once he's into the war, he of course is commanding troops in North Africa, in Sicily, and goes on to be the supreme commander of all the Allied forces in the European theater. The last of the really big name people to mention is George S. Patton. And during the maneuvers, he's commanding the 2nd Armored Division. And then by the time the war starts, he moves very quickly into some command positions in North Africa, in Sicily, and will go on to command the 3rd U.S. Army after D-Day and then to the conclusion of the war. There's a few other names that some real World War II buffs might recognize, names like Mark Clark or Walter Kruger or Vinegar Joe Stilwell, but the three I mentioned, Marshall, Eisenhower, and Patton, are the three really big names in the maneuvers.
Okay. Comfortable with that?
Yeah. If you guys are.
Okay, that was fine. How important were the Louisiana maneuvers to the later success of U.S. armed forces in World War II?
You know, the maneuvers had a tremendous impact on the U.S. military and its performance during the war in two aspects, one being personnel and the other being doctrine, or how the Army went about fighting. You know, concerning personnel, the maneuvers was the place where the Army really weeded out those commanders who could not measure up to modern warfare. George C. Marshall, who was Chief of Staff at the time, he was unforgiving in relieving commanders who did not measure up. So by the time the maneuvers are over, 31 out of 42 Army, Corps, or Division commanders had been relieved. Only 11 made it through the process. So he was unrelenting about this. Because, you know, by 1941, war in Europe had been going on for 2 years. And Marshall had no illusions about the quality of foe the United States was going to face in Hitler's German army. And so he knew he had to have the very best commanders out there on the field, and he was able to identify them there during the maneuvers. Now, as far as the doctrine of the way the Army went about fighting, it was during the Louisiana maneuvers that the U.S. really began to undertake the innovations necessary to put a modern force in the field. And these were innovations that the Germans, by the fall of 1941, had perfected. The U.S. is just really starting innovations. And we're talking about things such as taking the horse cavalry and making them really a very tiny part of the Army, turning instead to things like tanks and to air power, and how to get those types, that type of technology working closely with ground forces, in other words, combined arms and joint operations. It's during the maneuvers that the Army really gets their first exposure and experience to doing that. Add on top of that, supplying a modern Army that is mobile, that's constantly moving on the battlefield. All those experiences and learning lessons from the maneuvers are what's going to allow the U.S. to perform effectively once they actually get to Europe.
All right. How important were the Louisiana maneuvers in helping? What's that?
Just fix your wire on your mic there.
Do we need to redo that one?
No, it was fine. I just want to fix it for the next ones. I mean, it wasn't really that noticeable.
Sorry.
No. No problem. Okay. How important were the Louisiana maneuvers in helping commanding officers to develop their leadership skills?
Yeah, the maneuvers, if not essential, were critical, I think, to the development of some of the senior officers and their leadership skills. And we can start with George Marshall as Chief of Staff. During the maneuvers, even though Marshall wasn't there, this was an opportunity for him to really refine his organizational abilities. They were nearly exemplary by this point, but still he was able to refine organizing large force units. Even more important for Marshall in his position as the war was coming, the maneuvers gave him a chance to refine his political abilities. And what I mean by that is his abilities to deal with the civilian leadership in the United States, President Roosevelt and then especially Congress. For example, Marshall had to fight tooth and nail to get the funding just to carry out these maneuvers. Maneuvers on a scale that the United States had never seen before. Congress didn't want to fund. Marshall had to fight significant battles to achieve that. And it's those skills that he's going to have to draw on time and time again during the war to deal with Roosevelt, to deal with Congress, and then to deal with our allies, both the British and the French political and military leadership. For George S. Patton, the maneuvers really gave him a chance to show what he could do on the battlefield, a chance to demonstrate that he was indeed one of the rising stars in the U.S. Army. And from his perspective, to take his place as one of the best, if not the best, of America's battlefield commanders. You know, during the second phase of the maneuvers in late September of 1941, Patton leads his 2nd Armored Division on a very bold, sweeping maneuver against the opposition army. And what this entailed was a 350-mile maneuver departing from southwest Louisiana, heading north, cut over into Texas, then swung back into northern Louisiana, north of Shreveport. And by the time Patton had his tanks in Louisiana, north of Shreveport, he had encircled the opposition army. And at that point, the officers who were serving as umpires for the maneuver stepped in and said, okay, the maneuver's over, Patton's side has won. Well, Patton's opponents immediately started to cry foul, that Patton hadn't abided by the rules laid out for the maneuvers, that his forces had consumed far more fuel than the Army had allotted, and they accused Patton of using essentially his own credit card to pay at gas stations to fill up tanks as the tanks rolled forward. They also accused Patton of going beyond the boundaries, the geographic boundaries that the umpires had set up for the maneuvers. To all this, Patton just smiled because he knew he had won, and that was what he was after. And the truth is, what George C. Marshall wanted to see from officers in the maneuvers was just that. He wanted to see officers who had audacity, who had initiative, who had creativity, who understood that winning was what counted. And in Patton, that's what Marshall found. Now for Eisenhower, during the maneuvers, Eisenhower, he's the toughest perhaps to evaluate. Because of what he does later in the war. When we look at Eisenhower, we're always looking back through that lens of what he accomplishes as Supreme Commander in Europe. But at the time, again, Eisenhower was just a lieutenant colonel. He was well known in the Army as being a great staff officer. But among the general American public, nobody knew who Eisenhower was. You know, there were reporters there covering the maneuvers. And in one of the early articles written about the maneuvers, Eisenhower was referred to as Lieutenant Colonel D.D. Ersenbeing. Right? He was not known among the American public. But it's at the maneuvers where Eisenhower confirmed the thinking of George C. Marshall, that here was an officer who was brilliant at planning, who was brilliant at execution, and an officer who worked tirelessly once the battle began. And that's exactly what happens with Eisenhower. He lays out a fantastic plan for his side of the maneuvers. And then once the maneuvers begin, he manages the battlefield in really an exemplary fashion. So Eisenhower demonstrates how good he was at the role that he's going to have in World War II. And it's also at the maneuvers that Ike really demonstrated and realized himself that he had an innate ability for dealing with the press. His smile, his personality would consistently win them over. And this would serve him very well once he's in Europe, not just dealing with the press, but dealing with the French and the British.
All right.
one more.
What aspects of the terrain in Louisiana made it a particularly useful site for conducting the maneuvers?
Yeah, the Louisiana maneuvers were just one of three fairly large-scale maneuvers the U.S. conducted in 1940 and 1941. The others, there was one in Tennessee and there was one in the Carolinas as well. But Louisiana maneuvers were the largest, in part because of the terrain and the geographic features in Louisiana. The rolling hills and the river systems in Louisiana presented to the Army some legitimate obstacles to try to overcome, both for combat operations and for supply. And as the maneuvers operated, if one of the umpire officers who was sort of evaluating the maneuvers as they went along determined that a particular bridge, for example, had been destroyed, it was then up to the forces to decide, okay, how do we get across this river since the bridge had been destroyed? In one instance, however, a bridge was labeled as being destroyed. And they would put signs on the bridges that said, this bridge is destroyed. One of the umpires came back to the bridge to ensure that this was being abided by. And when the umpire got there, he found an infantry force crossing the bridge. And so the umpire hollered out at the corporal that was leading these men across. He said, hey, can't you see the bridge is destroyed? To which the corporal responded, sure we can. Can't you see that we're swimming? I don't know if he was promoted or demoted, but maybe that's the kind of officer that Marshall was looking for. The other advantage to Louisiana was that it was relatively rural at this time. And so what that meant was that the Army could conduct these large-scale maneuvers with minimal impact to the smallest amount of people. Now, there was damage to fields, fences, roads, but the government did come back and try to compensate or repair most of the work that they had done. But Louisiana just gave the Army a location that had the availability of land, obstacles, and scope that they could really see how well large forces would operate.
All right. What a great story.